Welcome to the Coaching Revealed podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Austin Matzelle. In this episode, we interview Pauline Fatien, an associate professor of management. Pauline conducts research in collaboration with public institutions, private organizations, and coaching and leadership development. Her work explores the myths of coaching, ethics of coaching, and power dynamics both inside and outside of coaching relationships. Pauline's work leads her to explore topics such as neutrality, including what is our understanding of the term, and what would it mean for a coach to truly be neutral in engagements. This question opens up on how power dynamics come into play in coaching relationships, between coach and client, and in more complicated power dynamics, including a coach, client, and third party. Concerning power, Pauline explains power from three separate levels: the macro, meso, and micro levels. For a holistic understanding, we discussed not only looking at the contemporary power dynamics of coaching, but also looking into coaching's roots, which involve a 21st century Western context and impact from fields such as psychology and sociology, and how all of these factors create specific effects on individuals. This understanding helps set the stage for coaches interested in learning about how power dynamics impact the coaching process and coaching relationships that they find themselves in. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Coaching Revealed. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Coaching Revealed. We are so excited today to have Pauline Fatien in the studio with us today. Pauline, it's great to have you with us.
Austin, thank you for hosting me.
Thank you, of course. And we're so excited to get into your research and your work on coaching and everything that you are exploring when it comes to the mythologies of coaching. So maybe just from a big picture, how did you get into coaching research? Because I know you research in coaching and you work in coaching, but you've not necessarily coached too much in your career.
Exactly. Even if I embed coaching into my practice as a researcher, as an educator, I don't practice coaching per se. But so I started to be interested in coaching about 20 years ago, in 2002, 2003. So maybe like many people who will listen, I was initially very seduced by coaching. I think that coaching is very seductive. At that time, coaching was starting to emerge, and I felt that coaching was providing some answers to organizational problems, and especially it was allowing to build bridges between contradictions, between tensions, for example, the individual and the collective, happiness and productivity. So I felt I was very attracted by this practice, which seemed to provide new solutions, new ways of seeing problems and new solutions to organizational problems. And actually, that's how I approached coaching initially. Well, I was initially interested in this answer that emerged and what made it legitimate, which means why were people buying coaching? Why were people educating themselves to coaching? What made it a solution to today's problems? And so what changed in the landscape to allow coaching to emerge? We could also say what disappeared when coaching appeared, And so I was interested not so much in coaching itself, but coaching as a lens to understand the evolution of actual problems, organizational ways of thinking that made coaching possible. So again, we could say that I use coaching as a lens, as an analyzer of organizational problems. And that's maybe how I went to the mythologies of coaching, because I believe that, coaching for many people and for myself maybe was kind of a promise, something that was very attractive. And I wanted to believe in it. And I think that's why, coaching for many people appears as a solution in a career that maybe, is not so fulfilling. So we turn to coaching as a way to reboost our career as a coach. And we come to coaching with many hopes, with many intentions, positive intentions that I think are sustained and nourished by the coaching industry. With this idea that coaching is very much portrayed as something positive, something good. An article by Bashkirova talks about these beautiful ideas that can make us ill. And so basically that's kind of my trajectory, looking at these beautiful ideas, coaching as something that is shining, but what is behind this light. And basically, through my 20 years of research into coaching, I've looked into the dark sides, the potential dark sides of coaching. What I've tried to do is to better understand these gray zones of coaching. And what I do now, or what I try to do, is to help coaches, educators, supervisors to better understand these gray zones in coaching, to practice coaching, to educate coaches with greater awareness on what they are doing and why they are doing it. Basically, bringing more reflexivity into their practice.
It sounds like you're just highlighting that coaching isn't a monolith and that you can't approach this concept, this idea, as if it's only one thing, and exploring all the different minutiae and all the different variables and factors that impact the individuals who are practicing the coaching or who are receiving the coaching.
Yeah, Austin, if I may, I'm sorry to interrupt you. If I may, you are saying something that I didn't mention. I haven't mentioned so far. It's that my dissertation, my PhD in management, was about coaching as a malleable practice. And that's how I explain the success of coaching. That's one way, I looked at coaching. I said that why is coaching so successful? It's because it's a malleable practice. It's like a clay. So what I meant was that there is sufficient understanding of what it is on a surface level. There is some flexibility in its interpretation, so that people can appropriate the practice as they want, which can explain. So again, this malleability, this ability for everyone to customize the practice to their own needs, explain the success of coaching. So as you said, coaching is not an homogeneous field. And I think that many scholars are increasingly saying that the practice today, the field, needs consolidation of its theoretical basics because given the heterogeneity of and the broadening and the emergence and the expansion of coaching, we need to better understand this kaleidoscope.
I really enjoy hearing you talk about, how coaching is something that is very malleable. As you're studying these different myths of coaching, what are some of those big picture myths that you've been exploring or beliefs that people hold about coaching that you're researching to see, do these beliefs hold up in study, in research?
I think that these myths are important in the sense that we can think of coaching as stories, as storytellings. And so very attracted by, this worldview. Coaching offers us another way of looking at the world. For example, the individual is resourceful. There is, we can have horizontal relationships. Everybody can bring their own expertise to the table. So coaching is about, benevolence, suspension of judgment. It sustains this idea that we are resourceful, autonomous. And so we want to believe in that. Coaching in itself, as an industry, we could say is about an industry about selling ideas about the self, ideas about organizations, ideas about the society. And so some of the myths or the dogmas that I have studied are, for example, the idea of neutrality. Coaching has been portrayed by some authors as the Switzerland of the helping professions, as if the coach was a neutral instrument, a neutral tool. There is many people, when they talk about neutrality, they talk about the detachment, they talk about suspension of the judgment that comes from this external position of the coach, as if this external position was bringing disinterestment. I want to encourage everyone to think about this, because I believe that there is never neutrality. Neutrality is not something that is a given. And this is when, with my colleagues, we researched neutrality in coaching. We saw that neutrality most of the time is given as granted. This is something that is an expectation or an assumption, while we believe that if we want to achieve or to seek neutrality, this is something that is that should be practiced and that should be acquired. It's not a given. My starting point is that no tool is neutral. if you use a pen, if you use a computer, if we have this conversation face-to-face or online, if you listen to this conversation in your car or in your home, this will not have the same impact. So for me, tools, management practices, management tools are not neutral. And I believe that if we don't tackle this myth of neutrality, we perpetrate without our awareness some worldviews, some ways of behaving that can be counterproductive. In the field of diversity research, we talk about benevolent discrimination, which means you want to do good, but in fact, by being blind to the implicit assumptions in the practices, in the tool that you are using, you are in fact producing counterproductive effects because you are not, again, aware of what the tool is bringing with itself.
Ready to advance your coaching practice? Join the Institute of Coaching and tap into the world's leading resource for coaching science and professional development. With over 4,000 members across 130 countries, the IOC offers invaluable networking opportunities with an elite global coaching community and innovative learning to broaden your knowledge and keep you at the forefront of coaching best practices. Engage in cutting-edge learning events with world-renowned coaching scholars, from webinars and seminars to discussion groups, research projects, and more. Try any membership free for 30 days. Use promo code IOC Podcast and visit instituteofcoaching.org/join to get started.
As you're talking about coaching and the idea of neutrality, I think when we're thinking about coaching, we're thinking about these positive, beneficial aspects of it, such as the coach is neutral, the coach isn't political, because that way it is a safe space for the clients to develop. And so part of what is being received by the client is the space that's neutral, the space that's safe for them. But if what the coach is providing isn't neutrality, it kind of sounds like one of the things you said earlier is that the coaches are helping the clients tell their stories. The clients are able to experience this coaching space. Outside of neutrality, what would you say are some of the benefits that coaching clients can look for from a coaching practice that isn't neutrality?
Again, I think that, this idea of neutrality is very complex, and I'm not saying that neutrality is not desirable. I'm saying this is something dynamic that can be achieved, negotiated, practiced. So maybe we will come back to this idea. What I've done is I've worked around the topics of ethics. Coaching can help people to go through tensions, through more ethical behaviors. I've also worked around the topics of oppression and emancipation. So, and I think that neutrality, is well situated between the two. And so all my work has been around understanding how coaching can be a practice of power, of control, of domination, and how also it can be a practice of freedom, of emancipation. With a colleague, Hani Shukri, we looked at a coaching education program that helps people move from being oppressed to developing emancipation through coaching education. And so, of course, this is a micro practice of recognizing the sources of violence, of domination in our environment, how they can also be located in ourselves, how we can be our own master, especially through the interiorization of some ideologies, some managerial thinking, to emancipating through acts of reflexivity, understanding of how power works. And so one key element in this dynamic is understanding how power is also something that we ourselves are authoring by accepting and relaying some social norms. So most of my work can be summarized around this idea that coaching is a practice that is serving a certain system. Some will say a neoliberal system. Some will say that coaching can be a practice of neo-capitalism, neo-colonialism. So, the most critical research around this line looks at coaching as a Western practice, as a white practice that is perpetrating some specific worldviews, which, if they are not questioned, can be dangerous when they are imported in contexts that hold different worldviews, different cultural assumptions. So if I come back to the topic of power and what I was saying about coaching as a practice that is serving a system, what I've been interested in is understanding how coaching can be at the service of certain form of identities, of certain form of being. It can relate to the work of Henri Lefebvre, or recently I've been interested in the work of Hartmut Rosa, who questions, how who we are is conditioned by social, cultural, economic, and political conditions. And in this sense, coaching can be a tool to develop ourselves according to certain economic interests. And as a consequence, coaching can be a tool that helps us flourish, function better in a certain system. So I'm very interested in this articulation between the individual level and the organizational, social level, and how coaching can be situated at this articulation between the individual, organizational, social level.
And so let's dive in a little bit more to your research and kind of break apart these different levels of power and where in your research you're finding coaches sit in the overall dynamic of power as a whole. So you have an article, Coaching Space, a production of power relationships in organizational settings, where you are exploring the different kinds of power and how power and space in relationships are impacted. As we think about the idea of power, what are these power dynamics that exist in coaching, and what kinds of power, what kinds of dynamics have you been exploring when it comes to the coaching client and the coach themselves?
Yes, so there are different ways of answering to your question. First, I would say, because you use the word space, that in this article that you mentioned, we who study space as a product. And so we looked at coaching as a social space, meaning a social product, because, for Lefebvre, every social space is a social product. There is no such thing as an empty medium. And so by looking at coaching as a space and building on Lefebvre allowed us to see how coaching is the social construction, how coaching is the result of a production in an organization. And I come back to, my initial, at the beginning of this conversation, where coaching emerged in a certain society. As I like to say it, it's not normal, it's not natural to be a coach. You are a coach as a result of a historical, social, cultural evolution. And so this coaching as a social space is the result of a product, an organizational product that created the conditions of this space. So, for example, the three-party contract, this triangular relationship, the fees of the coach, how things are going to be negotiated, all this is the result of an agreement, is the result of a discussion, and so is the result of a social construction. Coaching as a space, through the lens of Lefebvre, allows us to see coaching as a political practice. It's a product of an organization at the same time as it is also producing something. So, we have this dialectical relationship, a product and producer of power. And so what we saw in this article is that coaching can constrain individual. Through this research, we saw that the space of coaching can be limiting when through the coaching space, the coach does not have access to the whole organization, but only through a very narrow window of the problem. And, some coaches might not have the possibility to open the window, if I could say, and this will lead to what we call the individualization or the psychologicalization of issues, which means the reduction of problems to only psychological problems, psychological issues. It's one of the dangers in coaching to only treat the symptom, to only have a surface treatment of problems. And this is partly due to the dominance of psychological approaches in coaching at the expense of more sociological or philosophical approaches in coaching. The field is very much dominated by psychological approaches. And so it tends to put the finger on the individual. This is what we call individualization, or on psychological dysfunctioning of the individual. This is what we call psychologicalization. And this is what some people call the regression of the structural, of the political to the individual. And so this has been kind of a big fight for me in coaching research, to identify this individualization that is dominant in some approaches, and that is very problematic because, again, we come back to this benevolent discrimination. We want to do well, but because we are not aware of the tool that we are using, we are not aware that it's mainly a psychological approach to problems, we perpetuate the causes of the problem. So we only treat the symptom. We are not tackling the root causes. The seeds of the problem are still there. And so at the opposite of this continuum, so again, here we were in the limiting aspect of the space that is limited, that is narrowed. Coaching can also open to more empowering dimensions when through the coaching space, the coach has access to one element of the organization which will allow him or her to open a broader window on problems. And so the coach will be able, through this intervention, to help the coachee question what he or she is doing, what he or she wants, and question the position of the individual in the system. And so here, have a more critical, systemic understanding of the issues, of the problems, and discuss together through reflexivity what the client wants in the organization and in the system. This is very complex in the sense that there is no deterministic view of the space. This is like bidirectional relationship between the coach, the coachee, and the space, and the result is never guaranteed.
Yeah, as you're talking and you're describing, for example, the three-party contract, I can very clearly see the power dynamics and the organizational political dynamics that exist in a coaching space. Because, for example, if a coach is working, they've been assigned to a client, and the coach is working for this coachee underneath a contract that also involves the client's organization, then the coach is responding not just to the client, but also to the organization. And so the idea and the concept of neutrality becomes very challenging from an ethics or a logical standpoint, because the client may have desires, may have things in their best interest that are counter to the third party in this contract for the coach, which definitely impacts the coach's ability to be neutral, may impact the coach's ability to be benevolent to the needs of the client, because the client may be needing in their best interest to be leaving the organization, or maybe in their best interest needing something that the organization isn't necessarily willing or desiring to give to that client. And the coach can become an enforcer of the organization onto the client. So that's a really interesting way to view coaching as a political and as a power-based dynamic. And it makes me think about the researchers, some of the people you mentioned in this article on the coaching space, such as Dahl and Foucault, who talk about power in relationship and talk about how individuals are constantly exercising their power. As we're looking then at the different ways that coaches are utilizing power, you started talking about how coaches can be focusing on empowering their clients rather than limiting or controlling them through this idea of reflexivity. definitely would love to know, for our coaches and our audience, if they're thinking about their use of power in their coaching work, how can they be checking themselves and trying to be as benevolent as possible with their power and ensuring that at times that they are working to help their clients take on power and hold on to power, not be maybe enforcing power onto their clients?
Yeah, thank you, Austin, for this question. So you mentioned the issue of loyalty. Maybe we will come back to that later today. But to answer directly to your question, so you mentioned you use the word coaches and their power. And so I think it relates to the issue of how everybody sees power. And so it relates to our ontology, our worldview. And personally, I think that power is something that we exercise in a relationship. So some power is not something I have, but something I am in a relationship, through a relationship. I would say that coaches do not have power. That's not their power. That's our power. This is the power that we are constructing in our conversation, in our relationship. It comes back a little bit to what I said before about the fact that we always have some responsibility in what we're experiencing. And so we grant power to people. I am because we are. Power is something I personally locate power in the relationship between individuals. And as you mentioned, in this triangular relationship. This is really what makes coaching very interesting, that there are at least these three stakeholders, which will very much complicate the relationship compared to if you had only a dyad. Even if there are also, these unconscious parties that may not be present, but that can also play a role in a situation. And so that's why I'm also always very careful when people say that, this client is agreed to do coaching, but how much can you voluntarily agree to something when there is this contract, this work contract between an individual and an organization? Sometimes there is this voluntary submission to authority, which complicates this idea of benevolence in coaching. To answer your question, my first element was to say that power is, according to my way of understanding relationships, power is something that exists between us. And so it relates to my own ontology, my own worldview, my own way of conceiving individuals, the world. And so my encouragement, to answer directly to your question, would be to encourage coaches to be more aware of their worldview, their lenses. We are all wearing glasses on how we view the world, how we view power, how we view what is a good life, what is a good coaching, what is a good outcome in coaching. And so my encouragement to really build on coaching abilities to transform lives is to encourage professionals to be more reflexive about what do they hold true in coaching, how do they view the world, how do they view the client, how do they understand a good coaching, and where does that come from? To take nothing at face value and always question what we take for granted. And in my perspective, to always put things into perspective, into like a social context, the objectives that are assigned to us, always socially constructed in a context, in a cultural context, in organizational context, and asking who benefits from defining coaching this way, who benefits from defining the objective this way, whose interests are served by coaching. And you asked before, or you mentioned before, the potential loyalty conflicts in coaching. I like asking, who is the coach working for? Who is the client of the coach? Is it the coachee? Is it the organization? Or is it himself or herself? And so we conducted a study with my colleague, Jean Nizet, on identifying these tensions that coaches face in the context of ethical dilemmas. And we used a framework by Albert Hirschman of exit voice loyalty to explain how people when they were faced with challenging tensions, were in a loyalty conflict. So they could not express loyalty to both the client and the organization, the coachee and the organization. And so they had either to exit or to voice their opinion and their disagreement. And so we framed ethical dilemmas as a breakdown in this loyalty conflict. And solving this ethical dilemma went through either bringing more a voice or exit when it was not possible to voice opinion or disagreements.
That's a very fascinating ethical dilemma to put people into. I'm glad that you are out here putting coaches into situations like that to test out these theories. One of the things that you said that I love so much as a question is you were talking about for coaches to encourage them to consider what is it that you hold true about coaching. And then the following question was, and where does that belief come from? And so I think it could be good to talk a little bit about the macro, meso, and micro levels of power that you've discussed and researched in your articles. Kind of as a way for individuals to think about where are these elements of power occurring within their coaching agreements, their contracts, or in the conversations that they're having. So from your perspective, could we get a little bit of a breakdown of these different levels of macro, meso, and micro, and what that can mean for a coaching relationship?
So I think I'm going to develop some themes or issues that I started to discuss at the beginning of this conversation. At the macro level, so coaching took the form that we know today at the beginning of the 21st century. Tatiana Bashkirova talks about a growth situation. We were in a context where, we were quite optimistic, quite positive. It was mostly driven by the West with ideals of autonomy, of growth, of self-sufficiency. And so different authors are positioning, in fact, coaching as a byproduct of the 21st century. So this is this idea that coaching emerged as a solution to problems that people were facing, especially in the context of a growing externalization of services that used to be assumed or taken care of by the collective. My PhD supervisor, Gilles Amado, sees in coaching the defeat of the collective. The fact that many collective services have been outsourced, and as a result, there is this individualization, this outsourcing, this externalization of services that used to be taken care of in a more collective society. So at the macro level, again, if we also build on Lefebvre's thinking, coaching is a product of this 21st century, a solution, at the same time that as it can also reinforce the problem that it was supposed to take care of. Given also the geographical emergence of coaching, it's very much infused by Western ideals of self-sufficiency. If you want, you can. And so the resources are located in yourself, and the structural issues are not so much a problem. So I would say that this is very much the macro dimension that has informed coaching, and that can be challenging and questioned when, again, it is imported in non-Western context and when it can create damage. At the meso level, I think that most of coaching research has been focused on why and how coaching works. And not so much on these gray areas. And so most of the coaching research is serving a functionalist, performance-oriented approach, both in coaching and in research, with a very, I would say, consensual, functionalist view of organizations and of coaching, which means that, this is this idea that if we have problems, probably it's an issue of communication, and we will be able to improve problems through a greater dialogue, through a conversation between people. And so issues can be solved through the platform of dialogue. And so this is what is called a functionalist or consensual view of organization. to which we can oppose a more dialectical or more conflictual view of organization, where we believe that individuals do not always have the same interest, but can have conflicting interest. And so problems do not come from a problem of communication, but rather come from structural disagreements or opposite interests. If you use coaching in this situation, in fact, critical scholars will say that coaching is just a way, to provide orthopedic, we could say, to provide orthopedic work. It means it's gonna make you fit into a box while you are a circle. Okay, so it can be seen as maybe manipulation. You are conforming the individual to interests that maybe are not the best for him or her. And this is how coaching can become a tool of aligning individuals' interest into the organizational interest while neglecting fundamental opposite interest. So this is, this functionalist implicit view in coaching that miss a political dimension, and the political dimension precisely lies in this ability to question potential conflicting interest in an organization. So that's for the meso level. For the micro level, I think we have already mentioned the dominance of psychological models in coaching, which have a tendency to reduce problems to psychological dysfunctioning. But I think we already mentioned that. And so all this makes that coaching is approached as a technical practice, as a tool, rather than a political practice. And so it leads to questions in coaching education programs on how to use coaching rather than why. Why should we use coaching? Why should we not use coaching? What are the conditions? What are the limits? What are the limitations? When coaching is only approached as a technique, I think it's quite dangerous.
So as we're looking at coaching from these different power structures, we have the micro, the meso, the macro, the meso, and the micro levels. I think a lot of what you're really bringing attention to is for the coaches to have increased awareness about power, to have increased consideration about what their impact is. And so as coaches are looking at navigating this space, have you done any research that kind of can help coaches come back to this place of awareness, to thinking about what it is that they're doing and what impact they are having on the different individuals they are interacting with?
So we conducted some research on how coaches manage tensions and especially ethical dilemmas. So in the first article, we looked at how they use codes of conduct and how these codes can be limiting in their approach to coaching. We also conducted a study on neutrality, on how coaching navigates neutrality. And we showed how neutrality should not be something that is taken for granted, that is a given, but rather that is practiced. That is a practice that is negotiated through raising awareness, as you said. And there were three ways through which they developed their neutrality: through value awareness, self-awareness, and power awareness. My invitation, as you said, is to encourage coaches to be aware of what is important for them, what are the value that they bring to coaching. And I think this value awareness will become more and more important in the future. I recently attended a conference that was asking this provocative question: what if in 10 years, coaches will be recruited on their political orientation? This question may have different answers depending on the country, but I know that in France, we really not reveal, our political orientation or our salaries or these types of elements that maybe in the US, for example, we speak more about. But I think it reveals an evolution in the field, especially through with the emergence of artificial intelligence, where we question the difference between a robot and a human being. My encouragement is to work through this neutrality through developing this value awareness, this self-awareness, meaning understanding, why am I a coach? Where do I come from? Where do I speak from? So we could talk about positionality. Where am I positioned? How does my social trajectory inform the coach I am? Being a coach as a process. And power awareness, as we mentioned before. Who am I serving through my coaching practice? Basically, I think it goes down to this idea that coaching and ethics and neutrality is a practice. In this paper, with Ghazi Islam and Dima Luis, we talk about coaching as practice. And in another paper with Jean Lizet, we talk about ethics as practice, which means that we are not a coach, we are not ethical outside of practice. I'm not a coach or I'm not ethical before my practice or after my practice. I am ethical through my action. So I'm very much in favor of this vision that we are defined by our actions, and it's through our actions, it's in action that we are ethical. So I'm not saying coaches, I am an ethical coach. For me, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. I have an ethical practice, but not I'm an ethical coach.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your work and research with us today. I really, really appreciate it. For any of our listeners today who are interested in following along with your work or seeing what you're up to, what are some good ways that people can follow along with what you're doing?
Yeah, you are mentioning my upcoming projects. Indeed, I'm working on several projects around coaching makers and coaching bloomers, where I'm studying coaching pioneers. So with my colleague Bob Garvey, we are studying foundational figures of coaching pioneers who have structured coaching, and we try to understand how coaching was socially constructed through these figures. In another project, coaching bloomers, we are studying tensions that people who are educating themselves to coaching face, and especially what we can call epistemic tensions, which are these tensions that people experience when they open themselves to coaching and certain worldviews. So those are for the upcoming projects, and so people can follow my work through my books, through my peer-reviewed articles, also through some podcasts, and you can find them online in my LinkedIn profile or my ResearchGate profile.
Thank you. And we'll make sure to include those links on our show notes for today's episode. So Pauline, thank you so much for being here. It's been wonderful talking with you today.
Thank you, Austin.
And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of Coaching Revealed. We will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Coaching Revealed, brought to you by the Institute of Coaching. You can learn more about the Institute on our website at instituteofcoaching.org. You can stay up to date with new episodes of our podcast by liking and following Coaching Revealed. You can also find us on social media on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X with the handle Institute of Coaching. We also love hearing from our guests, so please reach out to us with thoughts you have on this episode and any questions you have about coaching. Until next time, this is Emily Tarani with Coaching Revealed.